Hello, welcome back to another virtual food safety office hours. I'm Abby Snyder. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Food Science at Cornell University. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Martin Wiedmann, and a panel of experts to discuss applications of AI to food safety. So, we're going to kick things off by having Martin give us an overview of what AI is, some examples of how AI has been applied to food safety, and a bit of a discussion of the challenges or considerations surrounding AI applications in food safety. So following that presentation, we will open it up for a discussion with our expert panel. As always, we'll stop the recording at that point so you can ask questions freely. I have your pre-submitted questions already lined up, but you can also feel free to ask questions here live by dropping them into the chat at any point. So our expert panel today includes Dr. Claire Zollner, Director of Data Science at iFoods. Claire earned her PhD in food microbiology in this department, and she has expertise in microbial risk assessment, modeling tools, risk-based decision support, and operation supply chain management. We also have Yeonjin Young, PhD candidate in this department, working with Martin Wiedmann. Her research focuses on developing agent-based models to improve pathogen sampling and control strategies at the retail level. And joining us is Luke Chen, postdoctoral scholar in the department working with Martin. His research focuses on developing prediction models to assess risk in food products and guide better risk management decisions. And so finally, kicking us off will be Martin Wiedmann, Gellert Family Professor in Food Safety at Cornell. Martin's lab uses a variety of computational and digital tools to solve problems in food safety and microbial quality. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Martin.
Thanks, Abby. So I'm going to, as Abby mentioned, I'm going to do a quick introduction and then open it up to the panel to answer questions, but also maybe contradict me or tell us how, there might be different perspectives because it is a fast-moving field as we apply AI to food safety. Okay, so outline, I'm going to do a little bit of an intro into AI, talk about some case studies, and then let's talk about some of the challenges, but I think leave a lot of the challenges up to and solutions to challenges up to the discussion later on. Slides are freely available, so if you want them, email Alex, email myself, and we can share the slides. As I said, I'm going to try to get through them pretty quickly, but if someone wants to recheck on them, just let me know. So this is a good sort of high-level overview of different aspects of AI and some of the different words that you might hear that Gustavo wrote. He's with Western Growers. So AI, high level, in technology that leverages computers to mimic human behavior. Then we have machine learning, which is a subset of AI. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. And then we have generative AI, which is probably the type of AI that most people or more people are familiar. This is like your classic, ChatGPT, etc., that you can ask questions and ask to write your emails to your boss if you're not sure how to write it, and so on. In food safety, as Gustavo outlined, there are some practical ways: predictive modeling, and that's using machine learning where we try to predict when there's a higher risk of contamination. Computer vision is probably one of the more important ones, and one of the ones that is used more already, where we use AI to analyze images, and that might be able to help us look at labels, for example, and other things. Can also potentially analyze videos. Some of the examples that I've heard of is that some companies are starting to use AI combined with video coverage to check whether, let's say, equipment X is really getting cleaned and sanitized every 30 minutes. And if it does not, and your analysis of your video coverage shows that this equipment did not get sanitized when it was supposed to be, a text message will be sent to a supervisor, essentially saying equipment X was not sanitized at its appropriate time frame. So these are some very practical applications that, at least from where I am, I already see in food safety and AI, analyzing video coverage and using that to monitor certain food safety practices. And then natural language processing, generative AI, think ChatGPT, and using that to look through audit records, inspection notes, to look at patterns, saying, if you got hundreds of COAs, certificates of analysis, ChatGPT could look through them and identify some abnormalities in them, for example. Um, in general, as I mentioned, when people talk about AI, I often talk more about generative AI, um, talk about, some of the more mature AI-driven products that might help you develop better models, such as in GitHub, etc. But these traditional machine learning models that really sort of simplistically speaking, some similar to statistical tools, often don't come to mind when people say AI. However, these machine learning tools have tremendous applications for food safety related data analysis. And I'll show you some examples as we go through them. And maybe Luke and Claire and others will mention some too. So high level, when we talk about AI, what do we talk about? And I want to not go through all of this, but highlight a couple of things. And I think the first thing that's important is the differentiation between, when we look at machine learning, unsupervised learning and supervised learning. And the way I think about that is unsupervised learning is essentially clustering. So I put a bunch of data into my machine learning algorithm and say, which things cluster together? Those of you familiar, this might sound very similar to PCA, principal component analysis. This can be valuable if you have large data sets. Let's say you scan in hundreds or thousands of certificates of analysis. It might tell you that these three just look different. All right. It doesn't tell you that there's something wrong with them, and different might be different good, different bad. But it allows you to sift through things and identify abnormalities. Similarly, you could generate a lot of data from a processing facility, traffic patterns, temperature, weather patterns, and just identify times when something looks different. Maybe, and it's not always clear what it is. It could be a combination of the plant ran longer and there was more humidity and the temperature was higher. And then just telling you that something is different and that maybe someone should look at what is different and whether that might represent a food safety issue or a potential food safety issue. Supervised learning, on the other hand, gives you a goal, a certain thing you want to predict, saying predict which factors might predict a higher risk of Listeria contamination in environmental sample. So you actually have to give the algorithm some sort of outcome. Listeria positive environmental sample. Listeria positive finished product with a higher total bacterial count. Okay. Now, in food safety, that can be challenging because, some plants never had a recall for Listeria. Some plants have one environmental positive for Listeria a year. So to apply supervised learning might be hard because you don't have enough data, you don't have enough outcomes, enough positives to use it very well. But you can still use unsupervised learning to identify when something looks different in the facility and look at that and assess that to determine whether it represents a food safety issue. And I'll give you some examples of how that is used. In general, AI can be embedded in hardware, part of the hardware, or it can be part of software. And maybe the one, most of us, many of us familiar is if you look at Netflix and it predicts, if you like this movie, you might like this movie, is one of the applications of AI in hardware. And they could similarly, you could envision a similar use saying, if this type of scenario gave you a Listeria positive, watch out tomorrow because the scenario that's predicted for tomorrow between weather patterns, day of the week, and so on, production volume might also carry a higher risk of Listeria. So one could envision similar applications, similar interfaces for food safety. When we look at where do we apply AI in food safety, high level, we can apply it to supply chain food safety risks, looking at data such as temperature, wind, land use, looking at using tools such as random forest, which is one of the machine learning tools, and trying to, for example, predict pathogen prevalence, pathogen risk in a field, at a farm, or maybe at product coming from a specific country when we look at imports. Public health, quite a bit has been written about predicting, outbreaks. And then looking into the lab as we talk about food safety, that's where a lot of the image analysis can come in very valuable. So for example, rather than counting bacterial colonies on a plate, we can take pictures. Sometimes we can take pictures with things such as different spectra and actually recognize colonies earlier and not just see, is there a colony there that might be too small to recognize by eye, but also get its different characteristics and be able to read a plate earlier to predict whether listeria is going to grow on a plate, for example. So those are some of the tools that will be more applicable in the lab and that already are being used in terms of image recognition. Again, image recognition, one of these big applications of AI. Motivations to use AI, pretty self-explanatory, mimic human behaviors, become more efficient, reduce labor, perform complex tasks, and then uncover certain patterns that are beyond human intuition, right? And that's, I think, where a lot of the prediction of food safety risk comes in. You might not realize that, Wednesdays or Mondays after a long weekend, when it rained on the Friday and your production volume is high, those are really your most risky days for food safety because so many different factors come in. AI can help you identify some of those things and some of those more risky times for food safety events, allowing one to then take actions to reduce food safety risks or manage these increased risks. And if you want to dig in deeper, here's a review that Luke wrote together with me and a couple other people that, for those of you who really want to dig in deeper, you might want to take a look at that. All right, now let's get a little bit more specific. Let's talk about some case studies. High level, raw material inspection is one area where I can see and we see a lot of applications, optimizing food safety and quality management practices, safety and quality assessment using more sensor technologies. So this is important because it's not just AI that gives us new opportunities for analysis, but now we're also measuring different things than we used to do in the past. We're not just going to do coliform counts and environmental swabs anymore, but we're going to do real-time monitoring. How does our equipment vibrate? What's the temperature of our equipment? What's the moisture? And use that to probably more better predict and with much more data predict high-risk food days or events for food safety as compared to 5 swabs taken in a 100,000 square foot facility. Monitoring of cleaning and sanitation, see a lot of opportunities there and starting to see companies using that. And then anomaly detection. Raw material inspection, probably one of the more high profile things, and FDA has been talking about this for a while, is how they use AI to help with screening of imported food products. And one could, while I don't know exactly what they did here, seems pretty logical. FDA has a long history of data when imported seafoods test positive for pathogens or food safety issues. They have a lot of data, what country it comes from, what season it is, maybe even what the weather patterns were, what is the economic data, how much economic changes do you have, price fluctuations, etc. All of that could be taken in a model that is a supervised model where you then predict the likelihood of a positive finished product. And that will help FDA or others to predict high-risk shipments and then to increase inspection, increase testing of these high-risk shipments. Something very easily can be applied and probably already is being applied by individual companies that bring in ingredients from a lot of different countries, where you can, again, even bring in factors such as economic instability, changes in economic parameters, changes in prices, price fluctuations, probably a huge predictor for potential food safety issues if you bring in things such as cinnamon, spices, other ingredients, particularly expensive ingredients, and our data that I would include in an AI model to predict the risk of food safety issues associated with some of the raw materials I bring into my facility. The company Mars talked about using AI to look at aflatoxin contamination risks. Again, this is a food safety risk that's been well established to depend on environmental conditions, moisture, weather patterns, location, etc. Predicting the risk of crops being contaminated with aflatoxin was possible before AI, but with AI, we can probably do better and more easy prediction of aflatoxin contamination risk and maybe do better prediction that can help us then manage our supply chains better. We have done some work to use some of those AI tools to predict contamination patterns of surface water. If we look at irrigation of produce, you can use some of these tools to say, water in this stream after rainfall with these temperature patterns is more likely to be contaminated with pathogens, and therefore allowing produce growers to better manage those risks, for example, by either using some technology such as UV light or chlorination to manage it, or use alternative water sources such as well water for irrigation when the risk of contamination of the surface water is high. So again, you predict risk, and then you use those risk prediction to manage that risk. We can predict fields that are more likely to be positive for pathogens. This shows some of the general models where blue indicates a relatively low risk of Listeria contamination. Red indicates a higher risk of Listeria contamination. And I think you get the idea how you could use some of these tools to make those predictions. Could be done before AI, but AI really makes it easier to do some of those predictions. Another example that was looking at different factors across facilities to see what is more predictive of, or what factors are associated with a higher risk of food spoilage, in this case of dairy products. We looked at data from a number of different facilities, used random forest to determine which ones might be linked to a higher risk of quality issues. And lo and behold, cleaning and sanitation practices, CIP detergents. So a lot of factors related to sanitation played an important role. Now, sort of good news, bad news, right? Good news is, yeah, that passes the common sense test. Bad news is you probably didn't need AI to predict that. You probably, because it's very common sense. So it's actually an interesting thing where we very often, when we apply those AI tools, the first findings we have are often findings that are very much common sense. So everyone's like, yeah, that makes sense. We sort of knew that to begin with, but you're convincing us that probably should take action now, where before we didn't. Classic example also when we analyze environmental monitoring data from processing facilities. First outcome often is like we find that one person is more likely to find Listeria than another. And everyone's obviously, yeah, we always thought Freddie was better at finding Listeria than Billy. But now that you show us this, maybe it's really time to train Billy to actually get better at finding Listeria. Safety and quality assessment, we talked about this a little bit in the context of microbiological lab methods. Hyperspectral imaging, so these are images that cover not just visible light, but wide range of spectra. You can take pictures of different things, whether it's a plate for microbial growth, whether it's an actual food product, etc. Use AI to analyze those data and therefore give you sometimes faster results for microbiology results, or give you prediction of some quality issues. Equipment cleaning and sanitation. This is the future of intelligent, some might call intelligent cleaning systems, where you now use different types of sensors. You use optical sensors, temperature, ultrasonic sensors, potentially vibration sensors, and you combine all of those and to look at, and then apply probably something like, again, supervised machine learning, where you say, hey, with all of these sensors, if we have these types of signals, we have a higher risk of maybe our testing of our CIP return water failing, and therefore we don't need to do the testing, but we can real-time predict when there was something imperfect in our sanitation. Some of you may have seen this. This was hit the news relatively recently about Cargill having these AI-powered, what they call robot dog spot at a facility. And it was an interesting example because, again, not much detail provided, but the idea is basically it's a robot which seems to move around a facility and then collect different data with what they call advanced sensors. The interesting thing is here, the case study they mentioned in this press release is detected this RoboDog spot, detected a piece of equipment that ran above safe operating limits with regard, appears to be temperature. Now, that's very easy to imagine, right? All you have to have is a robot, or maybe just take your Roomba from home, put a camera on it, it's an infrared camera, let it move around your facility, use unsupervised learning in this case, collect images and say, you know what, this equipment today looks different in its temperature than it looked the previous 50 days. And the temperature might be higher or might be lower. And then simply sends a message to a maintenance team saying, look at this equipment, something's different in it. And then if you go there, you realize it runs at a higher temperature. And therefore, it means the equipment is about to fail. And that could be a safety risk, could be an issue with production where now you have downtime, or it could be a food safety risk. You could add sensors such as sensors for even microphones to use auditory signals and analyze them. If the equipment sounds different, probably means something is wrong and it might break. So you can imagine some very low, very cheap sensors, but then AI really generates information that gives you early warning systems of not just food safety issues, but other issues in a facility that you can prevent bigger problems, whether that's downtime or food safety or quality issues. So I see a lot of future for these types of analyses. Anomaly detection, we talked about that when we mine food audit data. So someone could take, audit data, for example, from different suppliers and look at something that's unusual and say what, and use that to better sift through large numbers of auditing data. Generative AI applications in food safety. So this, what we talked about so far, was more sort of the classic machine learning, what used to be classical statistical methods. What we see how industry uses generative AI, writing food safety plans, and I somewhat flippantly say here, now we can have AI write a food safety plan that no one will read or understand. And previously we had an expensive consultant that wrote a food safety plan that no one read or used. So that we already see that. That's not uncommon, and we will see more of that. People already are using AI to get answers to standard questions like this. The interesting thing that I've seen is coaching. Companies are actively using that. So you can imagine someone actually having, before you go into a supplier facility for an audit, because they had a problem, you can walk through almost role playing with generative AI to say, okay, I'm going to walk into a supplier that has this, walk me through it. You have a conversation to prepare yourself for some of the difficult conversations. And that's something that can be very useful because if we go into facilities, whether it's as auditors, second or third party auditors, we can see that these conversations can be difficult, and having preparation and coaching for that can be very helpful. So not your classical thing you might think with regard to food safety, but still very, very important and valuable. And then as sort of a trial, I asked ChatGPT to write a letter to New York State Ag and Markets or regulatory agencies to complain about the last inspection. And lo and behold, I got a nice little draft to complain about my inspection. And when people looked at it like, looks to me like I'm already getting these letters. So this is already happening, right? That people will write letters to you as a company or to regulatory agencies that are largely supported by generative AI. Now, when we talk about generative AI, many of us are probably at that simple stage where it's simply about prompt engineering. What do we ask? What prompts do we give AI? There are better methods that can give us better results, that reduce hallucinations, etc. So you can get much more sophisticated than many of us may be right now when we just ask ChatGPT, yeah, write me a food safety plan or write me an SOP. What are some of the challenges? I think some of them are very foundational. Yeah, getting good data, getting data standardization. AI can help solve some of those problems, but if I want to use data from my own facility to predict a higher risk of listeria contamination, but my test results, my locations of my sample sites are not standardized in the same sample size. Sometimes it's called a drain, sometimes it's called a drain number 4, sometimes it's called drain A. If my product is, called different names with different spelling, it's going to be harder to get really good predictions, either with AI or with classical data analysis. Data availability, when we truly want to use AI to predict food safety risks, because these issues tend to happen rarely. If we don't have enough data, it becomes difficult to make those predictions reliably. And there is still quite a bit of hesitancy to share data between different companies, which could address that, okay? And then an overall digital infrastructure. And what I mean with that, it could be as simple as just having enough connectivity in a field to collect the data and share them. You can fly a drone over and collect hyperspectral image data, but downloading those data and getting them analyzed may be challenging if you don't have the digital infrastructure. Data standardization, people are trying to address that, even very specifically in food safety. FDA is trying to come up with a map for isolation source data. There's other systems to just further standardize names, etc., to facilitate that. So some of these issues are being actively addressed. I think this type of data preparedness, as Abby taught me about, is something that's really important for industry. Even if you don't use AI, at least try to be prepared to have your data in a format that you can take advantage of some of those tools. An interesting opportunity is to share some data to allow people to develop new AI tools. There are what's called machine learning repository available for a lot of different data sets. Heart disease. So for example, clinicals, hospitals might provide data on heart disease, different people, different characteristics, how likely are they to have, did they have a heart attack or did they not have a heart attack? And then anyone who's interested in can try to develop a better tool to predict the risk of heart disease, okay? These data repositories are almost totally not available for food safety. We try to address some of that, as I will show in a future slide. The easiest one to imagine, I just deposited a check in a ATM machine today. These ATM machines can recognize handwritten numbers. Everyone has different type of handwriting. How did we get there? There was a data set of 60,000 training images of handwritten digits, okay? People could use that data set, which is openly available, to build better tools to recognize handwriting. We need similar data sets for food safety questions to develop those tools. And Luke and others in my group worked on that. So we're starting to build a repository to help people share data. So if industry really wants some of these tools further developed, that might be important to consider. How can we make some data available to help others, more computer savvy people, more AI savvy people develop some of these tools? And here's a paper along those lines. We also addressed some of the challenges around data sharing. If you want to have some more on how do we share data, how can we share data in digital food safety systems, again, to be able to take more advantage of AI tools. Here's another paper you might want to look at. So with that, high-level take-home messages, both generative AI as well as machine learning tools can and already do provide tools to improve food safety and quality. People are using them. Okay, these are not just academic research type tools. AI, at least I see it as part of an overall digital food tools. This is not the only one. There's modeling, there's Monte Carlo simulations, there are other things that are not AI, but it's part of this overall toolbox of using digital data that will help us improve food safety, be more precise with regard to food safety than we were before. The focus, as very often, should be on the right tool to answer relevant question. AI might not always be the right tool. Don't just think you need to use AI because everyone uses it, but make sure you identify questions and opportunities where AI can really improve food safety and quality. And then we talked about the challenges around data standardization. Want to acknowledge people that helped me put together those slides, provided some funding to allow us to do some research on this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Abby to announce a workshop we are doing and then open up the discussion because I think that's going to be the most interesting part of today. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Martin. So I just want to bring to your attention an introductory workshop that we're leading on AI and food safety. Alex, if you could drop the link for more information, registration details into the chat. But it's going to be held virtually, so in real time, but via Zoom on January 26th and 27th. And it's 2 half days, so noon to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's introductory, so this is not a thing that requires prior coding skills. The workshop will be a combination of kind of structured discussion as well as hands-on training using AI to facilitate development and implementation of different food safety aspects or programs. And so, with a particular focus on the use of large language models. And so, topics are broadly like identification of applications where you can use AI to make your work more efficient, some ethical considerations for AI use in your company, and strategies for prompt engineering and output refinement. One of Martin's slides sort of touched on this already. So you can feel free to reach out to me or any of us if you have any questions. But with that, I'm going to ask Alex to stop the recording and we are going to start the Q&A.